Joining us now is Brian Mier. He is the co-editor of Brazil Wire. Brian joins us now from Brazil. Thanks for being here, Brian.
Thanks a lot. How's it going?
It's going well. It's always good to be speaking with you. We've been covering Brazil extensively on this show. Also have had you on the Majority Report, obviously. We're coming out of the shock of the incredible performance by the fascist candidate Jair Bolsonaro in the first round of voting. It looks like there might be, if I'm reading it correctly, maybe, on one hand, a couple of grounds for optimism in terms of polls and in terms of maybe in some ways potentially how the electorate is reading the election. And then on the other hand, maybe some really ominous signs that even if the polls are reversed, that we really are entering into a more kind of fully realized coup situation in Brazil. You'll correct me on that one way or another. But before we get to the specifics of things like what happened with WhatsApp and where we're at in the race, what do things look like now? Like, are the polls tightening up? Does it look a little bit different? And are the signals still being sent from Bolsonaro and the military that even if they were, that they're considering another scenario?
Yeah, the polls appear to be tightening a little bit. Dilma Rousseff was losing in the polls before the second round in 2014, and she still won. Mm-hmm. But the real question, the real issue is that Bolsonaro said if he loses, he's not going to respect the result. Mm-hmm. And he's got the military backing him up.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court now, and most of the media, and Wall Street.
Right. Take us through that. There's been a complete collapse of any sort of liberal pretensions of any type of kind of coalition or foundational concern about protecting democracy. I guess one exception seems to be The Economist, but obviously the business sector, both in the United States and Brazil, and you mentioned the Supreme Court. Maybe could you bring in and explain this WhatsApp story and how it's played out as an example of really how solidified everybody's getting on board with this fascist momentum right now?
Well, as it turns out, WhatsApp is a Facebook product. Mm-hmm. Facebook has a long history of screwing up elections.
Yes.
Normally benefiting the right. Mm-hmm. Zuckerberg, he donated 12 employees to the Trump campaign. And so WhatsApp is a Facebook product. It's a messenger system that you can use to send messages and make phone calls on via the internet, mm-hmm. which is how it got so popular in Brazil, because Brazil has some of the world's most expensive airtime. Mm-hmm. So when you can use internet, you save money. Nobody's making regular cell phone calls anymore, basically, because of WhatsApp. Mm-hmm. So Brazil's the largest consumer of WhatsApp in the world. Over half the population uses it, and it allows you to form groups of up to 256 people. Now, Jair Bolsonaro has been in Congress for 28 years, and he's only passed 2 pieces of legislation the entire time, and one of them, mysteriously, was related to WhatsApp last year. Okay, so anyway, several months ago, his son went up to visit Steve Bannon in Washington, D.C., tweeted out the photo. He said, Bannon's going to support us on the campaign. And whether he's supporting openly or not, it doesn't matter, because the tricks that they're using are the same as something that Bannon or Cambridge Analytica would do. Basically, last week a scandal broke that private businessmen, elite like rentier, comprador, business class actors in Brazil were paying millions of dollars to this illegal campaign slush fund. It was several times larger than the amount that Bolsonaro officially declared for his campaign. And the money was used to hire these tech companies to obtain personal information of millions of WhatsApp users in Brazil and set up these thousands and thousands of groups of 256 people each, called things like The Myth, Bolsonaro the Myth, and things like that, and just literally bombard targeted segments of the population with slander, lies, hate speech. And I'll give you a quick example. There was these Not Him protests all over the world a couple of weeks ago that were greatly underreported in The Guardian and the New York Times. They said tens of thousands of people on the street. Just in Sao Paulo, there were 150,000. And the protests took place in 20 countries around the world, right?
Right.
So these Not Him protests were women-led movement against Bolsonaro because of his misogyny.
Yes.
Okay, so the day of the Not Him protests, they sent out thousands and thousands of images, of slut walk photos, of topless lesbians kissing each other, and they targeted evangelical women with this, evangelical Christian women, and said they were photos taken live at the Not Him protests. And as a result, Bolsonaro's popularity increased by 5% in the polls in the couple days after the Not Him protests, and the analytics show that it was mostly evangelical Christian women. So, and this is just like one example of the kinds of dirty tricks they were doing.
They've said that like Haddad, and his vice presidential candidate, aren't that they're not married, that they worship Satan, or they've insulted Jesus. Again, all stuff designed to trigger evangelical voters. Yeah.
But even more sophisticated than that, right?
Yeah,
This is stuff that was clearly tested on people before they launched it. It's very sophisticated. They posted a film that was completely fake film, alleging that Haddad, as mayor of Sao Paulo, distributed erotic baby bottles with penis-shaped nipples on them to preschool students when he was mayor of Sao Paulo. And they said that they sent out a Photoshop photo of Manuela Dávila, the vice presidential candidate, with a T-shirt on that said "Jesus is a transvestite." And all kinds of dirty tricks and stories that would have been illegal. Facebook announced they were going to police this kind of thing during the election season on Facebook, but they didn't do it on WhatsApp.
Yeah, this is another reason why, of course, all these stories matter innately, and then there are these global parallels that we have to track. There was that investigative report, and again, this isn't Cambridge Analytics, and it's not necessarily at all the same, staff or anything like that, although we do know of these meetings with Bannon. But there was that investigative report that British journalists did where they posed as potential Cambridge Analytica clients. And the Cambridge Analytica executive, first of all, gave a sense of they've worked campaigns in everywhere from, I think it was Croatia to Kenya. And they used very specific examples of primarily, in some cases, actually potentially setting up real events in an attempt to, entrap and embarrass and blackmail politicians. But also the same sort of playbook with these fake news things, which, here I think in the United States, people have kind of pushed back a little bit because it's been used by basically some in the Democratic Party to sort of not want to take any kind of broader assessment or stock of the election. But at the same time, it did matter here. And it always plays to people's racial and gender prejudices, here very much so, obviously. But even, in a place like Kenya, it overlapped with, even as an example, in other, previous disputed elections in Kenya before Cambridge Analytics, like actual mass killings related to disputing vote totals. So this is what's happening in Brazil. We don't know it's Cambridge Analytics, but it's the same toolkit. And just as there's a shared ideological overlaps, even if there are differences of this global far right, they actually have a campaign and technology toolkit, if I understand you correctly, that's happening in Brazil as we speak.
Yeah, and it's obviously something that's too sophisticated for Bolsonaro's previously tiny political party.
Right.
And the limited intelligence of most of the people belonging to that party. Like most of the politicians are military or police officers or evangelical Christian pastors. There's no, or third-rate celebrities, but we do know from Edward Snowden that the U.S. and UK have set up intelligence services They have departments dedicated to manipulating information through the internet,
Right.
like the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group of Government Communications Headquarters from Great Britain, the GCHQ. I mean, their whole reason for existence is manipulating public opinion on the internet. So there's a lot of reasons to assume that this manipulation that's happening right now, it's almost a kind of massive brainwashing of the Brazilian people has at least partially come from the outside. It would be very naive to think that on a continent where the U.S. engaged in 44 successful coups d'etats from 1898 to 1994, proven, cited by Harvard in the Harvard magazine or whatever. It would be naive to think that the U.S. was not, or that American petroleum companies were not involved in this. So
right.
Anyway.
So what I want to hope. I mean, I don't know if there's no hope, we won't end with any hope. But I do want to talk more about the counter left strategy in Brazil. But before we get to, and also touch on Lula, this is the 200th day that he's been imprisoned, and obviously the backlash to him fits into all of this in a way that's particularly disturbing, given that, as I always say, Lula was the ultimate win-win leader. He did, managed to accomplish so much without actually really fundamentally harming any of the types of interests that we're talking about that are so damaging and dangerous. But before we go there, can you talk, I guess, specifically about some of the ways that you see the U.S. multinational influence, and maybe tie that with, you've been really persistent on the failures of the New York Times and the Guardian in their coverage of Brazil.
Yeah, well, first of all, when I talk about the U.S. influence, I'm talking about the expanded state in the Gramscian or Marcusian sense, which is it's the U.S. government and the institutions that support the U.S. government. And these can be the corporate sector, some educational institutions, think tanks, political parties, and big sectors of the media. You can't say that after all those reports on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that the American media wasn't supporting the U.S. To build enthusiasm for an Iraq invasion.
Right.
So I feel like the Guardian now, which is more headquartered in the U.S. than England, and partially owned by HSBC Bank from China, I don't know where it fits in to the U.S. expanded state. But in terms of U.S. involvement in this all, we have the involvement of corporate think tanks such as ASCOA, it's called American Society Council of the Americas. It's a think tank set up by John Rockefeller in the early 60s, which has been involved in almost every coup in Latin America. They offered to pay $500,000 to the Chilean Senate to block Salvador Allende's taking power when he was elected in Chile in 1970,
Right.
They invited Bolsonaro up on 2 occasions and had closed-door meetings that they facilitated between him and American business leaders, and then afterwards, Bolsonaro announced that his economics guru was this guy named Paulo Guedes, who is an ultra neoliberal, who was actually an economic attaché to Pinochet. So we see on one hand, we see conservative foundations, neoliberal in the case of ASCOA, but also the Atlas Institute is involved in the Brazilian far right. It's provided training and some funding for far right groups.
And that's that's Koch brothers funded, right? And that's a Koch brothers libertarian Latin America propaganda network, and they've been instrumental in a lot of right wing politics, modern iteration in Latin America, if I'm correct.
Yeah. Exactly. And there's a group called the MBL, which they've built up, Then we see I worked on this Al Jazeera listening post episode as a local producer a couple weeks ago, and we interviewed a guy running for a state Congress in Bolsonaro's party, and during the interview, the guy told me, "Well, we want to legalize guns because guns don't kill people; people kill people." It was like the first time I've ever heard anyone say that in Portuguese. Right. So that just makes me think probably the NRA is involved somehow.
Yeah.
Because why is a guy using an NRA talking point. And then we have the very obvious elephant in the room, which is systematically ignored in all of the papers, even the left-wing papers in the U.S., which is the role that the U.S. Department of Justice played in arresting Lula, in contributing towards the impeachment through this Lava Jato Operation Car Wash investigation, which is a joint operation between the Department of Justice, the SEC, Brazilian Federal Police, and public prosecutors' offices, which has already taken over $1 billion in fines for the U.S. government. The U.S. government, through the Department of Justice, collected over $1 billion from Brazilian companies through this operation. But the main objective has clearly been to perform character assassination against prominent politicians in the PT party. When the corruption scandals initially broke, they were across the board, all parties involved, but the only people who they've tried to prosecute have been really essentially, with a few exceptions, members of the PT party. And the tactics
and other left-wing leaders across Latin America, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, now the U.S. DOJ is using the Brazilian Odebrecht construction company as a kind of Trojan horse to attack left-wing politicians all over. So they've tied Michelle Bachelet up to some frivolous corruption charge involving Odebrecht in Chile. They took out. They took out he wasn't really left-wing, but he was a bit too much of a nationalist in the sense of protecting Peruvian assets for the U.S. to accept. They took out the Peruvian president. There have been 7 former presidents or current presidents and vice presidents that have been removed from office or had charges pressed against them through this Operation Car Wash, which is now international. And they've even arrested a former cabinet minister in Mozambique using Odebrecht, and with U.S. Department of Justice collaboration. Now, this isn't a conspiracy theory or anything, because Kenneth Blanco, the acting assistant attorney general, talked about all of this in a speech that was televised at the Atlantic Council in 2017. He talked about the constant informal communication between the U.S. Department of Justice and the Operation Car Wash team. The problem is that that's a crime in Brazil. Brazilian government officials are not allowed to have informal communications with foreign government officials. It's a sovereignty issue. This communication bypasses all of the checks and balances that were designed to protect the sovereignty of Brazil against imperialism.
And you don't, and again, like, they don't need to even direct which way it will go in terms of prosecutions or how it will be leveraged by Brazil's oligarchic media to know that, of course, if you sort of unleash this thing, that it will be politicized and that it will be used to go after certain actors, certain part, essentially to try to delegitimize PT party, which is how it's been used in Brazil. Can you indulge me just for 1 second here? And I don't want to get too detailed into this, but I did comment on this a little while ago about a very popular, supposedly left-wing YouTube commentator, and in some ways, I don't even want to bring you into this because I actually hope he'll have you on his show, frankly, to kind of correct the record. But in 2017, sorry.
I listened to you talking about him on the program.
Yeah.
So I know what you're talking.
And I guess and the biggest response I've heard is that I was being, or some people say I was just being rude and intellectually elitist by pointing that out, and other people said the videos from 2017 and no one could have any idea what Lava Jato was then. So could you, what do you think of that? It seems to me that in 2017, we already had a pretty clear signal of how this was being used against democratic forces in Brazil.
Well, yeah, it was a key factor in the coup.
Right.
Even to the point where the New York, and I hate to bring them up again, New York Times and Guardian, and I'm using them as examples, but you could say Washington Post, CNN, Atlantic Magazine, whatever you want. These journalists were constantly associating Dilma Rousseff with Operation Car Wash in the year before the coup. And she had no involvement. They tried as hard as they could. They couldn't even build any case against her in Operation Car Wash.
Right.
But she was associated with Petrobras, petroleum company corruption. Even John Oliver said something really obnoxious and ironic about it at the time that was untrue.
Yep. Yep.
And so
people have also gotten mad at me for criticizing John Oliver because of his horrific Mexico segment. But I guess for some people, their HBO Go funnies are more important than Latin America policy. But
I guess it's a bit of a pass because he did something good about Bolsonaro. A couple of weeks ago, everyone's sharing on. So maybe I'll give him a pass today.
I did notice on that video, if we're grading on a curve, the other thing he did too is he did pretty much say you got to vote for Haddad because you can't support Bolsonaro, which is of course the main point. And the other thing I noticed is that he did he acknowledged Lula was the most popular and said his arrest was a disputed issue and left it at that. So it probably is actually a real improvement.
Not good enough, though, for someone who calls himself a progressive. If he's saying Lula's arrest was a disputed,
I forget the words, or some say or something or other.